And so I needed a kind of a scene, something that he had done in recent years. And of all the people I spoke to, one of the things that just kind of lent itself to that as a device, as a prologue, essentially, to a book, was this anniversary concert at Madison Square Garden. And in particular, an interview I did with a guy called, whom you and fans would heard of, called Tommy Makem, who was one of those Irish folk singers from Greenwich Village, from Bob's very early years in New York, one of those guys that he met when he was just a young guy making his name. And by 1992, Tommy Makem was running a bar in Manhattan, kind of a pub, I suppose, Irish pub. And Bob Dylan, and he told me this story about how Bob Dylan came in one night, just came in on his own. They hadn't seen each other for years. And Makem was quite interesting in his observation about Bob being a kind of lonely, isolated, middle-aged man, very famous, but no one with him, and a bit melancholy, perhaps. You know, that's how Makem read him. And then this tied into the concert, because then Bob had this huge concert at Madison Square Garden, televised event, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, all these sort of superstar people. And then he had the after show party at Tommy Makem's bar. And so in terms of a writer writing a book, it was just a nice kind of, it made 2,500 words. I could encapsulate lots of ideas in it. And then I could then look back, you know, I could then say to the reader, well, how did Bob Dylan get to this stage in life? I suppose if you wanted to reduce it down to a soundbite, you could say he was having a kind of midlife crisis. He was in his, late 50s then by this stage, or mid 50s, no, early 50s. But he seemed older. He'd had a long career already. And in the 10 years previously, well, at the time, for instance, I really hated the gospel stuff when I was a teenager, an atheist. I was just horrified that my hero became a born-again Christian. I thought he'd gone mad, you know. I just was horrified. Now I'm an older person. I now see actually those were really terrific records. But then we had all those terrible, from Infidels onwards, it was just a sort of a sad decline, really, where he clearly just wasn't, he just didn't feel comfortable, or he lost his way, he lost his path in life. I think personally and professionally, he didn't really give a shit. He was bored, perhaps. He didn't quite know what he was doing or what he wanted to do. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. I mean, there's Oh Mercy and things like that. But I mean, when you look back on Empire Burlesque and Knocked Out Loaded and Down in the Groove, there's such disappointing records. I think in every case, there's at least one track on it that's interesting. I mean, he's always interesting, whatever he does. Even if he sang the phone book, you know, he'd be interesting. But it was a kind of, you know, a sort of there was obviously a great artist here, a great figure in the arts who was going through a fallow period up to, I suppose, those two cover albums, you know, especially World Gone Wrong, which seemed to be a turning point, really.